All right. Good afternoon. I hope you guys are all doing well today. My name is Amanda Rivera, and I'm the Executive Director of the Youth Development Institute of Puerto Rico. For those of you who do not know who we are a nonprofit and nonpartisan entity dedicated to improving the lives of children and youth in Puerto Rico through changes in public policy at both the Puerto Rico level and the federal level. And our work is focused on significantly reducing the high levels of child poverty in Puerto Rico. And we are going to be discussing that a little bit more in depth today. Because despite the fact that there are a lot of issues facing Puerto Rican youth, the levels of child poverty in Puerto Rico are so high, 58% of children living in poverty, that we believe that this is a major obstacle for children to achieve the outcomes that they deserve. And as we will discuss today, we also believe that it is a major obstacle for Puerto Rico's economy and sustainable development. Before we start, I want to thank the House Committee on Natural Resources, particularly Chairman Raul Grijalva and Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez, for not just hosting this event, but for their willingness to bring the issue of child poverty to the forefront of the discussion around Puerto Rico here in Congress. Just this past May, Chairman Grijalva invited me to testify about how this issue poses a threat to Puerto Rico's long-term economic sustainability in the committee's hearing about Promesa. And today, we are going to be able to present how we quantified this impact in dollars and cents on Puerto Rico's economy. We will also present a rigorous roadmap to significantly reduce child poverty in Puerto Rico over the course of 10 years. And if this concept sounds familiar to some of you, it is because a year ago, the National Academy of Sciences, under a mandate from Congress, released a similar report for the United States. However, this report did not include Puerto Rico in its calculations or recommendations. And some of the policies that were included there were also not really relevant to Puerto Rico's context. So at the Institute, we wanted to make sure that there was also a roadmap for our children, especially because the island's long-term economic sustainability depends on this. So we took it on ourselves to do this, and this is what we will be presenting and discussing here today. So today we're going to hear first from Dr. María Enchautegui. She's the Director of Research and Policy at the Youth Development Institute, as well as Brian Rosa, our Policy Manager, who are going to give us an overview of both the estimates of the cost of child poverty as well as the solutions. We are then going to move on to a panel of experts on the issue. First, we're going to have Mrs. Natividad Flores, a community leader from Aguas Buenas and grandmother, who's going to speak to what really those numbers look like in her real life, in her day-to-day life. Then we're going to hear from Bruce Leslie from First Focus, who's going to provide a little bit of a perspective on that broader conversation around child poverty in the U.S. and how that connects to the conversation around child poverty in Puerto Rico. And finally, Mr. Eric Lacombe from Jubilee USA will give us some context on how this issue relates to Puerto Rico's debt crisis. We will finalize by discussing some of the federal policy implications for this roadmap, including congressional and agency actions, and then we're going to open the floor for questions at the end. This briefing is just one of the many times you're going to be hearing from us. As some of you in this audience know, we can be quite persistent. And as long as the majority of our children are living under poverty, we will continue to come back. You will continue to see our faces. We will continue doing briefings until this issue is taken seriously and addressed. So thank you for taking your time to be here today. We know it's a very, very busy day in Congress. And we thank you in advance for engaging in this conversation and committing to action, whether it's through legislation or committing to advocate for this issue in the broader conversation around child poverty in the U.S. At the Institute, we really look forward to partnering to see some of these recommendations come into action. We are very, very insistent that these things don't just stay in a report. So without further ado, we are going to start with Dr. Enchautegui's presentation. Dr. Enchautegui is the Institute's Director of Research and Policy, as I said earlier. She's a renowned economist and formerly led the economics department at the University of Puerto Rico. She was a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and was a senior economic advisor at the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor.
It's good to be here. We're going to be presenting the results, the main results of the study that we entitle A Future of Child Poverty in Puerto Rico, how much it costs and what we can do about it. So as the title says, we want to envision how, if we do nothing, how that future would look like if we do nothing about poverty. The presentation is going to be given by both of us. I'm going to be talking about the cause of child poverty. And in the second part, we're going to touch the issue of the policy action that we can take to reduce significantly the child poverty in 10 years. The three takeaway messages I want to give you today is that the annual cost of child poverty is over $4 billion, and that represents 4.3% of the gross domestic product. This is costs that we are incurring that possibly could have a better use in other aspects, like, for example, promoting economic development, but we are using to mitigate poverty or to simply to pay for the consequences of poverty. That we can reduce child poverty significantly, and that it can be reduced from 58% to 37% in 10 years. And finally, that eradicating child poverty is costly, but it is more costly to do nothing. Let me tell you a little bit about the context of Puerto Rico, which possibly you have heard since we have been a little bit in the news, possibly in the last couple of years. But the economic model that guided development for decades in Puerto Rico is no longer feasible. As we may know, that model was based on exports, was based on foreign investment, mainly from the United States, and tax breaks, mainly federal tax breaks. That model is no longer feasible. It broke in 1906 when the 1936 tax breaks disappeared. Financing alternatives that were available before the crisis are no longer available. The markets are, as of now, closed for us. The last time Puerto Rico went to the market was about 5 years ago to borrow money. We just don't have any takers. We don't have money to borrow right now in the markets. The population of Puerto Rico is changing. First, it's decreasing drastically. The number of children, for instance, in just 1 year, between 2017 and 2018, the number of children dropped by 60,000, from 656,000 to 596. So the number of children in Puerto Rico and the population as a whole is declining. The total number of people over 65 is growing, as you can see in this graph. The institutional framework over which development was predicated in Puerto Rico is basically bankrupted. We are saying no to a lot of the institutions, and you possibly heard about the last summer when thousands and thousands of people went to the street to demand some change. We have over 600 children in poverty. 6 out of 10 children live in poverty. 58% of children in Puerto Rico up to age 18 live in poverty. We are using data from 2017. This amounts to 383,000 children living in poverty. These children, all the children of Puerto Rico, carry a heavy burden. They carry the future of Puerto Rico. They are the one who will have to pay the debt. They are the one who has to construct a new Puerto Rico. Who are these children, and what is their life look like? The mean income of the poor children, of the one that I tell, the 383,000 that live in poverty, is less than $10,000. Those who live in extreme poverty, with poverty rates up to 50% of the federal threshold, live with annual incomes of under $4,000. 3 out of 4 live in single-parent families. 2 out of 3 live with parents or guardians that doesn't have a college education. That me? No, okay. 3 out of 4 don't live in their own home. They live in rental homes. And 2 out of 3 live in households where the head is unemployed. This is the face of the household where these children live. What are the consequences for these children of living in poverty? What are the consequences for the country? This is the story we want to tell you. Throughout the time, throughout many different occasions, different people take a part of the story, and possibly we can focus just as children, because the costs for children are humongous, right? Are very big. We know that they go to poor quality schools, their exposure to crime and violence is high. We know that a lot of the health outcomes are not good. We know that the education of these children, sometimes they drop out of school, they don't go to the university. And we know about toxic stress. We can be forever talking just about this, about the consequences that this has for their children. We wanted to take a step further and take it as adults and see what are the consequences that this has as they grow up. So the consequences are lower earnings, higher unemployment, poorer health, more victimization and criminal activities. And we can leave it there too, but we don't want to leave it there. We want to take it to the country, because this is the story that we want to tell. We want to tell that this is not an issue of the children, their families, and what happened to their adults. This is a story of Puerto Rico. This is about less productivity, lower quality of life, lower output, less prosperity in the future, because the quality of the labor force is just not as good as to support a good prosperity for Puerto Rico. So we need to make this connection about what happened when they are children, but we want to take it all the way to what are the consequences for the country. Some of these children will do well and will overcome all the obstacles of poverty and will succeed. We all know poor children that were successful as adults, right? But too many of them will be left behind. What data did we use for this study? We use a lot of different data. We use international Puerto Rico studies, data from surveys that are representative of Puerto Rico. We calculated a statistical relationship between poverty and children outcomes. We use data on budgets, data on municipal indicators. And more importantly, we also use the voices of the community. We interview around 20 low-income mothers to see how these things were in a day-to-day basis expressing in their life. What would Puerto Rico be like without child poverty? This is the questions that underline this study when we try to answer the question of what is the cause of child poverty. How do these things change? How do salaries would change if we have less poverty? How would chronic diseases, mortality rates will change? How does the crime will change? How would the expenses in special education would change if we have less poverty? So we start with loss of earnings. Children who grow up in poverty during most of their life, and we calculated that about 75% of Puerto Rican children that are poor at some point, they will be poor all of their lives, 75%. That is very high. For African American children, the comparable figure is 59%. We calculate 75% for Puerto Rican children live most of their life in poverty. They are less likely to go to college, more likely to leave school. They go to lower quality school, and their household are less able to provide activities to increase their education. And this results in lower earnings and higher unemployment. The productivity level goes down, the consumption level goes down, and there is loss of salaries. We estimated that more than almost $2 billion every year are lost in Puerto Rico because of child poverty in terms of salaries and unemployment. Also salaries, which means lower earnings and higher unemployment. Health costs, that was the other dimension. We focus on 3 dimensions here. We focus on earnings, we focus on health costs, and we focus on crime. These are the main 3 dimensions. There are others. So these estimates are always a conservative estimate. We follow those 3 because those are the most common addressed in the literature. Health cost. Children who grew up in poverty during most of their lives are more likely to have cognitive disabilities, more likely to be in special education, and more likely to be exposed to toxic stress. This means more health expenses, more special education expenses, less year of healthy life. These are a couple of clips that have come in Puerto Rico showing the health problems that low-income children are having. Higher asthma, for instance, higher obesity rates, higher mental health issues. What are the health-related costs? We estimate $1.3 billion, or 1,376 million, in health-related costs due to poverty. I mean, we clean these numbers so we can say that these numbers are the ones that we can say that they can be attributed to child poverty. Costs due to crime, the last and third dimension that we estimated. How poverty affect crime. Children who grew up in poverty during most of their lives have greater exposure to violence and crime, less schooling, and less opportunities. That means more public spending, and public and private spending to deter crime, loss of life, loss of property, pain, and suffering. All those are the costs of crime. The cost due to crime that we were able to measure, we didn't include costs of pain and suffering, so this is a really a very conservative measure. We estimated $1 billion annually of all the costs of crimes can be attributed to child poverty. To sum up all these measures, we have almost $2 billion in lost earnings, $1.3 billion in health costs, $1 billion in crime, for a total of $4.4 billion, the cost of child poverty in Puerto Rico, 4.3% of the GDP. And per child, this is over $11,000. We estimate that if poverty goes unaddressed, if we do nothing, these costs could be repeating themselves every year. What can we do? Now is the second part where we focus on the policies that we think can move children out of poverty.
Thank you, Maria. I also wanted to take a chance to introduce Brian Rosa. Brian is Public Policy Manager at the Institute. He has specialized in public policy analysis as it relates to youth workforce development and youth and children in disaster and recovery context. He has a master's degree in public management and policy from the Robert Wagner School at NYU. And part of what Brian is going to present is what I believe the study on the cost is hugely important because it allows us to make this an economic development argument. But really what Brian is about to present is what gives this a lot more strength because we now have some solutions. There's no more excuses about this being an issue that cannot be resolved. We're doing it's a pretty easy to follow roadmap. And so we feel that by putting this forward, we can no longer continue making excuses to not address this. So I will let Brian talk to you guys about this part.
Great, thank you, Amanda. So what can we do to solve the problem of child poverty in Puerto Rico? Well, first, we looked at a lot of the literature around reducing child poverty, not only in the US, but also internationally. What are other countries and other cities and states doing to address this? We came up with a lot of recommendations, but then we came up with a policy analysis framework to figure out which were the best policies that we would include in our roadmap. And I wanted to show you, before we talk through all of the policies, what were some of the criteria that we used to determine which policies we included in the roadmap. Well, first, we tried to find the policies that added more money directly to the pockets of families with children. Then we wanted to know how many poor children will be impacted. Yeah?
So we're going to take a little break because the Congresswoman has come to make a few remarks. We had already thanked you for co-hosting this briefing and everything you have done to put this issue at the forefront here in DC. So we'd love to hear just some remarks from you.
Thank you. And I'm going to be short. I'm going to be short, but I wanted to be here for many reasons. First of all, thank you for joining this panel and allowing not just members of Congress, but staffers as well, the ones who draft actually the legislation and push forward that, to address an issue of poverty on the island, of child poverty and family poverty. In our case, we do have more than 48% of the island is under the poverty level line. So a lot of the initiatives that are discussed in the manual are how to raise that bar and how to move forward economic tools for those families. 43% of U.S. households are unable to afford basic housing, food, among other things. That's not different from Puerto Rico. That's not different from the territories. In our case, even when HHS identify that 4 in every 10 kids have one of the leading triggers in terms of their future development is the poverty. And for me, that was the first time I read something like that. So I think that's the reason that study that you have in your hands is so good, because it would allow you to see the direct effect of that poverty in the kids and, of course, in the future. One of the main issues, and I just want to focus on that before going to another hearing, is child tax credit. Child tax credit is one of the tools that is being used here in the States to promote and getting people out of poverty. In the case of Puerto Rico, we never understood why child tax credits apply if you got 3 kids or more, but not 1 or 2. So it's like ridiculous that this program may work just if you got 3 kids or more. I don't know if somebody wants people in Puerto Rico to have more kids, but not the first and the second one. So when we revised that kind of legislation, first introduced in 1997, then an amendment in 2001, and again in 2017, increasing the amount of money that is available for those kids. Territories, in this case Puerto Rico, is not included. $2,000 per child under the 17 years of age, which is $1,400 will be refundable and $500 will be not refundable. Are part of the tools we need in Puerto Rico, not just to take a lot of people out of poverty, but also to improve the economic development of the island. The Tax Policy Center estimates that 91% of the families with children will receive a child tax credit of $2,400 in 2018. Again, we are not counted in that statistic. So I really believe CTC is a powerful weapon against poverty, and that's the reason I fought and I discussed this with both chairmen of the Ways and Means during the last Congress and this one, and I thank Chairman Neal to include this provision of child tax credit to Puerto Rico in the current supplemental that is included, and I applaud that, and that's the reason I was supporting it. That would allow, in terms of 4.3 million people out of poverty in the whole nation in 2018. Of them, 2.3 were children. That statistics is not that different if you look at the numbers for Puerto Rico. When we revise the significant impact of economic well-being of low-income families with children, we can also see how the consequence of these programs may impact directly the long-term health, long-term education, long-term employment that many research and many American survey data just examined and concluded that growing up in poverty, and I'm quoting here, introduce stressors to children rapidly developing brains that can undermine health, cognitive, and social emotional development with differences in children's cognitive abilities by income appearing as early as 9 months old. So that's the reason what we're discussing here is so important. One of the reasons this CTC is so important as well is this is a boosting opportunity for families when they can expand their income opportunities for their children. I just want to give you some numbers. 45% of the general population in Puerto Rico is under the poverty level line. Of this number, 55% live, it's between children, live in Puerto Rico, and 39% is in extreme poverty. So that numbers may get higher when you just include the children. When you compare that to Mississippi, Mississippi got just 19%. 19% versus 45% or 56%, depending on what you want to study. So we are using the same numbers as you are using in the nation. And when you compare the Census Bureau in terms of the lowest mean household income, it will be $19,000 more or less in Puerto Rico compared with $43,000 in Mississippi and $61,000 average in the nation. You will see a complete difference in terms of the access to services and the well-being of the people. So that's the reason we just got access to partial part of the CDC, and we just want to expand that to the first and second child. Extending this will have a direct impact on 355,000 families and 404,000 children that will be able to get the CTC, which means $273 million going directly to them. So those are numbers. I love facts because we can differ in many of the results, but the facts are those numbers. Same thing happened with the earned income tax credit. I'm not going to discuss that in depth today, but those two measures will help Puerto Rico to get out of the poverty level line, will help the island as well to move forward. And I think this is the way you fight poverty. This is the way you provide tools to those families, to those kids, to those women. So in that sense, I wanna say thank you to this institute. We've been working at Aveira and you for the last 3 years. They've been committed. They've been looking for facts, studies, initiatives, and I will say that everything that is in that booklet is a roadmap, is a path for Congress to act, is a path for the state government to act. And there are several initiatives that can be done in both areas, one in the state level and other one in Congress. In terms of Congress, you got child tax credit and earned income tax credit, both measures included in the last supplemental approved last week. So now we got a job to do on the Senate side to push for those two initiatives. No matter from what side of the aisle you are, you should be fighting against poverty. We should be fighting against limiting opportunities to kids, and that's what these bills are for. So I want to say thank you to all of you for your time, for supporting this for the island. And when we see that in Spanish, Instituto de Desarrollo Juventud, that's what we're looking for, to develop opportunities, develop a future, not just for kids, for those families as well. So I want to say thank you again to both of you and everybody working with the Instituto for providing us the tools, the data. You will be surprised. Many of these data is not available in the state government. So it's because of their work that we've been able to bring the private sector together, bring the civil groups together, and actually move this in Congress. So with that, thank you, and sorry to interrupt you guys.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Congresswoman. Actually, that leads perfectly into our conversation about solutions and some of the policies that we're recommending. So, Brian, if you want to.
Great. So we did take a look at the child tax credit. We will discuss in detail soon. So to follow through this, we also looked at the impact in the poverty rate, the evidence around the solutions proposed, and also the cost of those solutions. So to that end, we came up with 4 groups of policies. The first one are the tax policies, and there we included maintaining the local earned income tax credit at its current level over the next 10 years. We also included the extension of the child tax credit, as well as creating a welfare to work opportunity tax credit that will work locally. The other group are economic and work policies. Here we also looked at subsidized employment by the government. Also, we modeled creating a universal child allowance program for children in Puerto Rico. Following, we looked at policies that will remove barriers to work. Here we looked at ensuring access to early child development programs, extending after-school programming for children, and also introducing a two-generation model that will work from schools, public schools. Lastly, we looked at the human capital development policies. These are policies aimed at increasing the ability of people to increase their entering the labor force and entering on a competitive labor force. So there we looked at developing a sector-based work training program and also revamping high school and associate degree completion programs. So most of these policies exist already, and we have them. So we looked at what would happen if we work through having them very efficiently. And I know this is very abstract, and I only have a limited amount of time, but I wanted to walk you through how this would look like in a family in Puerto Rico. Let's say we look at a data point and we find Michelle. Michelle is a 28-year-old mother who lives in San Juan. She's the mother of Adriana, who's 3 years old, and she's also the mother of Gamaliel, who is 9 years old. She has a full-time job, works as a security guard. She's paid the minimum wage in Puerto Rico, which is $7.25. Annually, that will be around $15,080 every year. So effectively, Michelle wants to earn more money. She wants to be able to provide for her children. But oftentimes, Michelle finds herself either taking Adriana to work because she doesn't have any childcare available, or even leaving work early so she can pick up Gamaliel from school. So these are things that are blocking or preventing Michelle from entering a higher earning job or a better paying job. So effectively, Michelle is in this situation. She's under the federal poverty threshold for a family of 3. So then what can we do? How our policies will impact a family like Michelle? So let's look at the tax policies. Let's say we have the extension of the child tax credit, and also we maintain the local earned income tax credit in Puerto Rico. That would bring her salary up to $17,580. Still not enough to get her over the poverty threshold, but it's more money that she's getting. Now, let's combine that with another policy that we included. Let's say we help Michelle find a job through a sector-based training program in the health sector in Puerto Rico. And let's say she's also being supported through a case management effort in a two-generation model in Gamaliel School. These things could really help her find a better paying job that could help her enter a better position for her children and herself. Thinking about also having childcare and after-school program that will be around $19,000 estimated in cost. These are things that will remove barriers so she can either finish a training program or find a job. So that money doesn't go directly to her annual income because it's a subsidy, so that wouldn't add up to that amount of money, but it's still a good support for her to get her through. So at the end, once she finishes the sector-based training program, she finds a better paying job, and then we recalculate the EITC and the CTC effects. Her new salary will be $20,137, effectively lifting up Michelle and Adriana and Gamaliel out of the poverty threshold. This is not enough. She's very near poverty still, but similar policies and consistent policies throughout the 10-year program will help her be lifted even further above the poverty threshold. So this is how our policies were modeled through statistical analysis, and we found that they have a big effect on families with children living in poverty. So we did a lot of permutations of the policies. We grouped them in 3 groups. I want to show you the results of group 1 or combination 1 of the policies. You have further information in your packets. So when you look at the graphs on your left, you'll find the effects on poverty. So you look at the blue lines, you see how over the 10-year timeline we propose, child poverty goes from 58% to 37%. And then when you look at deep poverty, it drastically drops from 39% to 11%. So then you think about, so how much will this cost? So you look at the other graph, And then you find the blue line will be the policy cost, and that burgundy line will be the poverty cost, the cost of not doing anything or doing things the same. And in every situation, not only in this combination, but in all three combinations, we found that it was more costly to keep doing things the same as they are than to actually actively tackle child poverty in Puerto Rico. So yes, it is costly, but it is more costly to do nothing. When looking at percentage-wise, so 37% is still a pretty high poverty number when you compare it to the states. But we're talking about a lot of people here. There's a lot of people when you look at percentage-wise. So let's look at the earned income tax credit, for example. In our study, which you can find also in our website, you can see in detail how these policies have a huge impact, not only on people living in poverty, but those who are living in deep poverty or near poverty as well. So here, the earned income tax credit, when modeled to a 10-year timeline, we found reductions in all three groups. And you see those percentages, and you say, like, that's not really a whole lot of, that's not a big number. But that's a lot of people. That is a lot of people included within those percentage points. The same when we modeled the idea of ensuring access to child development programs, to early child development programs. Here we saw a bigger impact, and that's, again, a lot of people being impacted. These are only children, but think about the mothers impacted, the fathers, the parents, the grandparents. So this is a very important aspect of our policy. It has major impacts for the family as a whole. And then when we looked at the child allowance, we modeled what would it be if we had $100 per month per child versus $150 per month per child. And those are huge impacts on deep poverty. You can see that yellow line. So again, a whole lot of people will be impacted by these policies if implemented correctly. So how can child poverty be solved in the midst of an economic crisis, which is another question that we thought about. So how can we actually do this without, or in contingency to, working with the economic situation that we're having? Well, the policies that are part of this roadmap are actually part of an economic development strategy. These are not opposed to what any government would do to address poverty or economic crises. Reducing child poverty is a jumpstart to the economy of Puerto Rico. These are not different paths. And then also some of the effects of this policy agenda are more employment, greater labor force participation, better education, greater productivity, better health, better quality of life. And these are all things that any economic development strategy would include otherwise. So looking into the future, Puerto Rico prosperity depends on our ability to eradicate poverty. It's not a question of why we should do it or how we should do it. It's really about when are we going to start taking this as a serious issue. Because it's not only something that you would do because we like and we all like children. It is something we need to do because the economy of Puerto Rico and the sustainability of Puerto Rico depends on it. So child poverty is expensive for Puerto Rico. We saw the numbers. We're $4 billion every year. And child poverty is not a problem that without a solution. It can be solved if we all really try. Eradicating child poverty costs a lot, but it's more costly to do nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. As I said earlier, the next expert we have on our panel is Ms. Natividad Flores. Ms. Natividad is going to take all those numbers that we just discussed and really give us the day-to-day of what does that look like in a real person's lives and what are the challenges that families with children are facing. She was born in Aguas Buenas, Puerto Rico in 1958, and at 19 she left Puerto Rico and she lived in New Jersey and Hartford. She came back to the island to assume custody of her grandchildren after the death of her daughter. And today she lives in the tight-knit barrio of Bairoa in Aguas Buenas, which is a small rural municipality of around 30,000 people that borders the San Juan metropolitan area. Natividad is a very active abuela and community leader in Aguas Buenas. She has served for years in voluntary programs for school, church, and civic committees. And last year, she founded Redes de Alcance, a community group focused on community development in her hometown. She's also part of the Youth Development Institute's Leadership and Advocacy Development Program. So without further ado.
Good afternoon. On January 6, 2010, my daughter died at 27 years of age, and I obtained custody of my two grandchildren of 5 and 8 years, respectively. At 51 years of age, I began the job to be not only a grandma while I visit Puerto Rico from Hartford, Connecticut, but a full-time mother, father, and grandmother. I moved back to Aguas Buenas, Puerto Rico, my hometown, to take responsibility to raising my boys, and that is not an easy task. When I arrived to Puerto Rico, it was impossible to get a job. With an associate degree in secretary work, the waiting list I got put on, and the amount of copies of resume were unbelievable. Today, my physical strengths are not the same. The challenges are different. And at times, my health weakens. But my fighting spirit remains firm and latent for a better future for my grandchildren. I am responsible for the care of 2 children in the special education program that are mental health patients because they witnesses the fatal accident that ends the mother's life. The boys have 3 years of difference and very opposite personalities. It's still a challenge for me to know what role I should play in each situation that the day-to-day bring to our life. For the last 10 years, we have been through many challenges, goals that have been met, and goals that we have yet to meet. We, as a family, suffered the constant change in public policy in the areas of education, health, and security, to which both my grandchildren and I have had to adjust. Our biggest challenge is the economic part. The expenses of our home, the purchase of clothing, school materials, and medicines that sometimes the government health plan does not cover, make us go through a difficult time and a lot of uncertainty. I am constantly worried about how to meet. As my grandchildren have grown, expenses have increased, and living costs are higher. Currently, my grandchildren are 15 and 18 years old. JC, the eldest, is a graduation candidate in his high school, and with him having turned 18, his Social Security assistance ends. This moment of celebration also means an anxiety for having additional expense. When though I planned for this, for the start of the school year, costs related to graduation have proven to be higher than expected. JC helped with expenses and even has stepped in to pay for grocery by taking a small gift as DJ family and community events. William is also already in a high school and a top normal person and school expensive. Now internet expenses are added. In the classroom and for homework, they must have a smartphones to search for information. At home, a computer to be able to do the homework and projects. that increases our monthly expense. And I'm now looking to pay for internet service for our house so he can complete his work home. But it is an additional expense I have never budgeted for. After Hurricane Maria, the earthquake of last month, and the strong tremors that are currently shaking the island, not only us, but all children, youth, and Puerto Rican families, we face having great expenses, emotional problems, and stress for not having the resources necessary to provide quality of life that our families need and deserve. For instance, we have suffered long blackouts that force us to throw away rotten fruit from our refrigerators and incur in unplanned expenses that we simply cannot afford. The uncertainty of good quality of life for our families has us in constant struggle to survive. I wonder, what do we all want for our children and grandchildren? I wish for mine and for all the children of my island, Puerto Rico, equity in resource and opportunities for them to have good jobs and fair wages so that their performance is of quality and they can contribute to the economic development of our country. This is going to take a courage and determination. After reading, studying, and asking many questions about the story of the Jumps Develop Institute, I am full of hope, and I learned like we can make a huge and valuable change in the life of many Puerto Rican children. I am convinced that we can reduce child poverty with leaders and public servants who pledge to implement this proposal for them to not be a dream, but a reality. Today, at 61 years old, I'm Natividad Flores Velázquez, an abuela from Aguas Buenas, Puerto Rico. Pledge my determination to be part of the change with contributing my support as a spokesperson here by doing whatever is necessary to obtain the best living conditions and development opportunity for the Puerto Ricans, children, and young. God bless us, and thank you.
Gracias, Nati. I think there's two themes that I take away from Nati's remarks. One is the constant toxic stress in which families are living in constantly when they can't make ends meet, and what this means to them on the day-to-day and also on the development of their children. And I think also underlying there is a theme about migration and how the lack of opportunities really is forcing a lot of young people and young families and families with children to have to consider to leave Puerto Rico if there's no better options. And Nati herself has been part of the circular migration, and a lot of us have. So I just wanted to make those two remarks because I think those were two very interesting themes that I saw popping up there. I want to then move on to Bruce. Bruce Leslie has more than 30 years of public policy experience at all levels of government and a demonstrated commitment to improving the lives and well-being of children. He is the president of First Focus on Children and directs the policy development and internal operations of the organization. Bruce, I leave it to you to make some remarks about how this relates to the broader conversation that you guys are having.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you. I just want to commend you all on this excellent report, and definitely, I was, having read through it, it's a awesome roadmap on what we should all be doing, both here at the federal level, but also in Puerto Rico to really improve the lives of children. Also want to thank the both Congressman Grijalva and Gonzalez for hosting this briefing. So a couple of things that I want to first talk about is, I want to talk a little bit about this report that occurred, and then also point out the shortcomings of it because it didn't really address issues for Puerto Rico. So first of all, there was a National Academy of Sciences study. It basically had sort of these four major things, some which are very applicable to the discussion today and this report, which is one is that child poverty is a solvable problem, and I think it's really important. I think sometimes people think that it's intractable and there's nothing we can do, and I think that report and this report show absolutely. There's absolutely steps we should and must take to really address child poverty. Also that other countries are doing it, so it's not like, there's a roadmap that we can look to other places. Canada just instituted a child benefit and is cutting child poverty. The UK's done it. New Zealand's just embarked on this effort to do the same. So the things in this report are absolutely doable, and in fact, I would say that we must do them. And also, as you both pointed out so well in your analysis, is that it makes smart economic sense to be doing this. It's actually cost effective. The cost of having families and children living in poverty are enormous, and so yes, there's a cost to addressing that problem, but in many ways it's less than what's going on now. So next slide. So here's a chart from the report that really talks about all the different things. So what's important to understand from this slide is it's not just one thing. It's not any one thing we can do. And so that's what makes it a difficult issue to address, but it's totally solvable. And the combination of several of these things, so whether you're talking about sort of tax credits, whether you're talking about SNAP, food stamps, those kind of programs, school lunch, child support, all those things work together to basically cut child poverty in this country. The other thing is this measure here is the supplemental poverty measure. One of the things that's really important to recognize also that is Puerto Rico is not included in that. So we don't even know the impact of this. So in addition to all the things that we need to do that are outlined in this report, we also need to address the data problems and really help understand what's going on, and then we can measure the progress we're making in a better way. So this is from your study, and as you can say, there's again, just to highlight, there's a lot of different things that are important here, and what I'm going to focus on a little bit is sort of this issue around the child allowances, the child tax credit, and the earned income tax credit, and sort of the effect that those have. But I want to highlight that we believe all of these things should definitely be a part of this package, both here at the federal level, but also back in the Commonwealth. So the first thing is what's a solution? And so the first thing to do is to look to Amanda. And so I was looking up kind of solutions that people proposed, and as the Congresswoman talked about the child tax credit issue, well, this is an article that Amanda did 2 years ago talking about this issue and really talking about it's a multi-pronged strategy, again, as we talked about it, but it's something that Congress can and must do. And that's by extending the child tax credit. The Congresswoman talked about this, but the policy we have right now is ludicrous. It basically says that Puerto Rican families get a child, some type of child tax credit for the third and fourth children, but not the first two children. Like, what kind of incentives, what kind of rationale is that? So we don't value the first two children that people have, but only at the third one do we care? In Massachusetts, they actually had the opposite policy, which was the first two, but then they didn't value the third, and they just got rid of that. And their policy, we should value all children. A child is a child, no matter what their birth order. And so this is a ridiculous policy that we should fix immediately. The good thing is that in the supplemental, the emergency supplemental appropriations for Puerto Rico, there was actually these two things that were included in the tax policy side, in addition to the importance of the aid to Puerto Rico for the earthquake, was the child tax credit provision was included, and so it does add the first 2 kids. And second is it also, since Puerto Rico enacted their earned income tax credit, there was a provision, Section 104, that actually provide matching assistance from the federal government to support that. And so 2 really important things were included in that package. And again, it passed 237 to 161. I used to work in the Senate, so I apologize. But you all know that the problems of sort of moving things in the Senate, and so getting this out of the Senate will be difficult, and also President Trump has threatened to veto it in part over these provisions, these tax provisions, which is very shocking considering that one of the things he always talks about is tax policy. So one thing I really want to highlight is the public's all about this, all about addressing child poverty in this country. So not only is it a doable thing, so thinking about the barriers we have, one is people think it's something we can address. We can address it. This report highlights that. Second is the public's there. So this is a poll we did and asked this very policy of should we cut child poverty in this country in half? And this is all Americans, including Puerto Ricans. Obviously, and what you see there is that by 71 to 17%, people said yes. We overwhelmingly support. Our pollster, in fact, was very amazed by this number because they said, in this time and era where everyone's so cynical, 25% of people say no to everything that you poll. You could ask people if they like, I don't know, apple pie, and man, 25% of people say no to everything. So we are getting people who are opposed to everything in this. And also, if you have an intensity level over 40%, it's really high. And so you can see there's a huge intensity level around this idea. But also just other things in the kid agenda. Fundamentally, we should be adopting a best interest of the child standard. Is it in the best interest of a child to only give a credit to people when they're the 3rd or 4th kid in a family? No, that doesn't make any sense. And so these kinds of things we are definitely have a wide array of support by the public. The other thing I want to highlight is other issues that are important. So I talked a little bit about, in addition to the policy, there's the data, and we should be cognizant of that. As there's bills going through Congress, we need to think about how they impact the territories and the Commonwealth, but also Native Americans, other populations. So definitely as bills come across, think about that, keep that in mind. The other very important thing is that grants must be equitable and fair. And time and time again, Congress, I won't say that it's purposeful. I think sometimes it's just neglect. And so bills passed that say grants will go to states, but do not include Puerto Rico and stuff. So like there's a program that we think is very important, things like home visiting programs and things like that. Puerto Rico is not eligible for a lot of these programs. There's a great report that we should all look at, and anytime these bills come up, we should make sure that it doesn't just say states. It must also talk about the territories and Native Americans as well. So often they're also left out. So that's a key thing, and here's a perfect example of that I just want to highlight because it's such a big problem for Puerto Rico, which is Medicaid is a matching program, and it's an entitlement. In Puerto Rico, it is not. It is and the territories, it's a block grant. So it's a flat amount of money no matter what is going on. Well, we know what's happened in Puerto Rico in the past few years. We've had the hurricane, we've now had the earthquake. The problem with a block grant is it's some arbitrary amount of money that Congress decides. So they say, we're going to give you X. And you can see the blue line, that light blue line is how much Congress gives to Puerto Rico. The total 9 is the need. So we're only giving Puerto Rico a fraction of what is necessary. The dark blue line was money in the Affordable Care Act, and that was going to expire, and money's been restored there, but it's still short of what is really needed. If you look at, for example, Oklahoma has a similar population size. Oklahoma gets 10 times more federal money than Puerto Rico does to serve its kids, and I would argue that the need in Puerto Rico is much higher. I don't even think you have to argue. I think it's obvious. And so, so I would say a child is a child, and a child in Puerto Rico is as valuable, if not, as a child in Oklahoma. So we need to fix these inequities, and it's an enormous amount of money to the Commonwealth. Couple things that are wrong with basically block grants in healthcare is that they don't adjust for demographic change. They don't adjust for, and you know, you guys talked about the aging population in Puerto Rico is increasing dramatically. They don't impact natural disasters. I used to work for Bob Graham in the Senate back in the 1990s. Right after a hurricane, he talked about, you know, the acts of God and block grants do not mix. So as need increases, block grants don't adjust. So it's a huge problem. Economic recessions, block grants don't adjust. Public health crisis, sometimes you have both, right? So after the hurricane, we not only had all the increased need, but then we also had public health crisis going on. So you had two things that where need was increasing at the very same time. The federal support did not change, not one bit. Also, I think we all hope that we have medical breakthroughs. If there was a cure tomorrow for Alzheimer's, there would be an increase in Medicaid spending all across, you know, the 50 states, but not in Puerto Rico because it's a flat amount of money. So those are all things I just wanted to highlight. And also, and what does that do? It leads to rationing of care and services in the Commonwealth, and it pits populations against each other, which is unacceptable. So just to sort of highlight, you know, this is my takeaway would be a child is a child, and it doesn't matter where they happen to live. And so equity and fairness demand that we address these issues that are included in this report and these other programs, not just Medicaid, but any grant program that comes from the federal government. Puerto Rico should be able to access those grants just like anybody else. Yeah, and this just also highlights it, and so you can sort of see the benefits per enrollee. Puerto Rico gets far less money, like less than a third of what the median state in the country does for Medicaid when the need is higher. So and there's real effects. So at the time we wrote testimony to the House Energy and Commerce Committee. This was right after the hurricane, and we were talking there about how doctors are fleeing to the mainland or refusing to accept patients on Medicaid, leaving children without access to pediatric or preventive care. So there's real impacts of the policies that we are failing to provide in the right way in this country. And with that, I think.
Thank you, Bruce. I think you bring up a great point about the importance of making sure that Puerto Rico is considered as this broader child poverty agenda is moving. A lot of times we're left out, and the territories in general. So I thought it was a really great point, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now we're going to move to Mr. Eric Lecomte. Eric has led religious groups to win policies that alleviate poverty, address global conflict, and promote human rights. He is the executive director of Jubilee USA Network, a development coalition of more than 650 religious groups and U.S. organizations. In 2016, Lecomte's congressional testimony on Puerto Rico would become part of the basis for the debt crisis legislation that Congress passed. In the same year, he testified to Puerto Rico's Oversight Board on a roadmap to resolve the island's crisis while protecting its vulnerable populations. We are happy to have you here, Eric.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks to our friends, Chair Grijalva and Congresswoman Gonzalez, for speaking today. I know many of us are grateful for their leadership and the leadership of many Republican and Democratic offices, and also to the members and offices present today for your focus on Puerto Rico. It's been a privilege to work with many of you for many years on debt, tax, trade, anti-corruption, and transparency policies to protect the vulnerable and reduce child poverty. A very special thanks to Amanda Rivera and the Youth Development Institute for organizing today's vital briefing and producing a truly excellent report. My organization, Jubilee USA, represents national U.S. religious bodies, congregations, and institutions. Our founders and member groups range from the Episcopal, Presbyterian, Evangelical, Lutheran, Methodist, United Church of Christ Churches, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, American Jewish World Services, and humanitarian relief agencies. More than 700 faith communities, churches, synagogues, and mosques work with Jubilee USA across our great country. We've worked with Congress and successive administrations on debt issues for more than 20 years. Because of the agreements that we've achieved together, Congress is responsible for making our financial system more responsible, more transparent, and developing countries have seen over $130 billion in debt relief to support children's education and health care. Yesterday, I was struck by an event with the heads of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank who were focused on whether or not emerging global debt crises around the world and high debt levels could be balanced while poor countries are attempting to finance the Sustainable Development Goals. To put this in perspective, according to UNICEF, 22,000 kids, 22,000 children under the age of 5 around the world die every single day because of poverty. 22,000 kids a day. Because of the lack of good debt, tax, trade, and transparency policies. Unfortunately, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and balancing soaring debt payments seems unlikely. Too often in debt restructurings, we focus first on how debt can be paid as opposed to how this process can end child poverty. Paying the debt and restructuring debt to make it profitable again in Puerto Rico and elsewhere is an important question. Legal legitimate investors should see some return on their investment, and ultimately restructured debt should use tools like debt linked to economic growth, GDP, and investors can accordingly receive greater returns. Economic investment that's successful in Puerto Rico is good for Puerto Rico. These questions face Puerto Rico when we see child poverty estimates that range from 56 to 58%, and we ask, how much will new debt plans for Puerto Rico reduce child poverty? The religious institutions we represent believe that at the center of all decisions, we should ask, how will this decision impact the vulnerable? In the Catholic Church and other Christian traditions, we call this the preferential option for the poor. For more than 6 years, many of us focused together on the debt and austerity challenges that face our fellow American citizens in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, we work closely with our partners, religious leaders representing more than 95% of the island's people. These leaders include the Catholic Archbishop of San Juan and the head of Puerto Rico's Evangelical Bible Society. In 2015, then Governor Garcia noted that Puerto Rico's debt could no longer be paid. In that moment, it was San Juan's Archbishop Roberto Gonzalez, the Evangelical Bible Society's Reverend Heriberto Martinez, and other religious leaders that raised the alarm in Time magazine that Puerto Rico's people and children were suffering from the $72 billion debt crisis. A debt crisis borne on the shoulders of the vulnerable and affecting vulnerable children. A debt crisis children and vulnerable people did not create, but they are suffering disproportionately because of this crisis. At the center of this debt restructuring, Archbishop Gonzalez, Reverend Martinez, and Caritas Catholic Charities head, Reverend Enrique Camacho, have consistently called for any debt restructuring process to diminish Puerto Rico's child poverty disaster. Before 2 hurricanes would decimate the island in the fall of 2017, almost 50% of Puerto Rico's people lived in poverty, and nearly 6 out of 10 kids on the island lived in poverty. The effects to children were felt on numerous levels because of the self-imposed austerity. Public pension money for families, for children, was used to pay debt service. Self-imposed austerity in Puerto Rico by 2016 closed 250 schools, cut special education for low-income children and all children, eliminated certain emergency health services. Cuts in law enforcement, emergency personnel, and healthcare spending would ultimately leave Puerto Rico unprepared to deal with a Zika outbreak and 2 hurricanes, and now daily earthquakes. We reviewed possible debt crisis solutions from the Federal Reserve action to extending existing U.S. municipal bankruptcy law. The political will for Federal Reserve action did not materialize, and extending existing U.S. bankruptcy law would have only been able to restructure about a third of the $72 billion debt. This was the backdrop as several of us sat on the same floor in a room down the hall for a hearing almost exactly 4 years ago today. That hearing sketched out a blueprint, a compromise that would offer greater fiscal transparency and a comprehensive bankruptcy process for the people of Puerto Rico. That would eventually become the Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act, or PROMESA. Before PROMESA would be signed into law in the summer of 2016, negotiations would create a law with an oversight board in exchange for a super bankruptcy process. The legislation was a compromise, a board in exchange for bankruptcy. The legislation did several things. First, positively, it created certain protections for Puerto Rico and bipartisan recommendations for reducing child poverty. Second, negatively, it allowed too much austerity, as we already went over, specifically in terms of the impacts of children. Third, unfortunately, some of the most important promises from PROMESA, many specific to child poverty, have not yet been fulfilled and present a failure of implementation and a possible issue of noncompliance. Number one, positively, it stopped $8 billion from reaching the hands of creditors because of the stay imposed in the initial prevention of creditor litigation. It prevented some of the worst predatory hedge funds, or so-called vulture funds, from coming in and turning Puerto Rico into a free-for-all situation, as was the case when vulture funds held the country of Argentina hostage. It created the first comprehensive bankruptcy process to deal with all debt since Germany's 1953 London Accord. It protected the multi-stakeholder debt audit process to audit all of the debt. And most importantly for our conversation today, it created a bipartisan committee to reduce child poverty that was supposed to move forward Medicare-Medicaid parity, the child tax credit, the EITC, other funding initiatives for protecting the vulnerable. Number two, negatively, we've seen some poor debt deals negotiated, such as the COFINA or sales tax-backed bonds move forward, meaning that revenues that should be going towards child poverty reduction are going towards debt payments. Ultimately, we've seen too much austerity, and the actual bankruptcy promise to Puerto Rico, made to Puerto Rico, has not been fulfilled, as most debt deals have been solved by negotiation and not by bankruptcy. The newest plan, just released on Sunday, has some positives and some negatives. Our question of concern with children at the center is the same as it was in June. Is enough debt cut to get, as the Holy Father, Pope Francis, said last week, is enough debt cut to get to sustainable debt levels? Ultimately, the more disaster aid and recovery monies we win, it helps buffer this. The other items that affect this is how the surplus in the plan of adjustment, which comes out in April or March, is being spent. Will that surplus be spent on child poverty reduction? Will it be spent on investments in infrastructure to bolster economic growth and child poverty reduction in Puerto Rico? Here are some of the challenges with the new plan that was just released. $6 billion in illegal debt was settled, violating Puerto Rico's constitution. A certain type of hedge fund bond debt that, again, was in violation of the Constitution was legitimized. And the payment, and this is very important, the payment was again backed by Puerto Rico's sales tax. So again, that does several things. It reduces revenue to deal with other needs on the island, but even more specifically, and perhaps most what we're most concerned about is that this means it'll be harder for Puerto Rico to get new financing for all of its needs because they have less revenue. So in other words, if you're able to show lenders less revenue, that you have less backed monies, it's going to be much harder to borrow for development. What's good about the plan, and I think what's helpful about our conversation today, while certainly our preference is that the pensions would have been fully protected, we have to understand this is one of the first debt deals where pensions are protected and not obliterated. So the pensions were robbed to pay Puerto Rico's debt. When that happens in a state, in a country, or a territory, you say goodbye to that money. It's gone. It's treated as unsecured debt with no backing. So in this new plan that's supported by several unions, the pensions are now secured, meaning that there now will be future money for the pensions. It means that if your pension is less than $1,200, you won't see a single penny cut. It also means that for any pensions that are cut, the highest that it could be cut is up to 8.5%. So in terms of understanding debt restructurings, this is critical because pensions are generally privatized, and if the money was already spent to pay the debt, the money's not coming back. So this is very important. For labor, the deal was a win in terms of locking in collective action bargaining rights. And we know if we're serious about ensuring a living wage in Puerto Rico, we know collective action bargaining is critical for this. I think that also, there's a question of whether or not paying the debt sooner, 20 years as opposed to 30 years is better, but the way it's structured, it looks like this can produce more real revenue for Puerto Rico sooner. Overall, much of the plan is reasonable, but again, it depends on a lot of factors. And this leads us to the issues, number 3, of the promises not kept to Puerto Rico, the failure of implementation and possible issues of non-compliance with PROMESA. Other issues that have failed to move forward are the recommendations from the bipartisan committee to reduce child poverty, such as Medicaid, Medicare parity, funding for vulnerable populations, moving forward the tax credits. And I think we also have to understand, in terms of understanding corruption and the challenges in Puerto Rico, there is an issue of noncompliance, and that PROMESA was one of the first standards in moving forward an audit committee to audit the debt and understand very specifically from a multi-sector approach where that debt came from. And in closing, this leads us to 3 particular policy recommendations for policymakers here for in Congress, several of which have been highlighted by my colleagues today. First, it's absolutely critical to move forward the bipartisan recommendations to reduce child poverty that Republicans and Democrats agreed together need to happen to reduce child poverty. Again, that's the child tax credit, it's the EITC, it's Medicaid, Medicare parity, it's funding assistance for vulnerable communities. Moving this forward, again, had strong bipartisan support, the majority Republicans on the committee. We need to move it forward. It's exciting that it is in the earthquake supplemental. B, it's absolutely critical that we start to talk about as Congress, and we know it takes a while in Congress, but now to talk about phase 2, 3, 4 of hurricane disaster relief. The reality is, at best, we're $70 billion short of what Puerto Rico needs for recovery. Not only is this important because it actually impacts real people and real Americans that are suffering, if we start to move forward these pieces, even in a supplemental way or a piecemeal way, it creates more revenue that's not in the current debt plans or plans of adjustment, meaning that it buffers the plan and can make the plan successful because we have more revenue that's going into Puerto Rico. So this is a very crucial area. And the third area, and this is influencing the plan of adjustment on the newest debt deal of $30 billion, which is going to come out in March or April. The plan of adjustment essentially is how do we now spend this big multi-billion-dollar surplus that Puerto Rico is supposed to have if Puerto Rico's new debt plans move forward. Spending that surplus is key, and the roadmap that comes out in April and March is one that we need to directly advocate with the Puerto Rico legislature, with the Puerto Rico governor, and the Puerto Rico Oversight Board. It's imperative that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle reach out to members and staff of the Oversight Board and say two things. Number one, we believe that the surplus for the plan of adjustment should be going towards child poverty reduction. We need to take this surplus, and we can now finally take this debt restructuring plan as a move to reduce the child poverty disaster taking place in Puerto Rico. The second thing that's critical is that the surplus is spent in investments in Puerto Rico. So, for example, if there is an investment in building more resilient infrastructure, building better infrastructure, which is a normal thing for how surpluses can be spent, this will have huge repercussions for children and families all over the island. So influencing that plan of adjustment, number 3, is critical. So again, it's a real honor to be with you today and be a part of this rollout report. And a special thanks again to Congresswoman Gonzalez and Chair Grijalva, as well as the Institute and Amanda for hosting us today.
Thank you, Eric. Okay. So before we open the floor to questions, I wanted to quickly summarize what I believe are some of the policy implications at the federal level that have come out from this conversation. First, child tax credit. I think everybody mentioned it, the extension of the child tax credit for families of 1 and 2 children in Puerto Rico. There's enough bipartisan support at this point. We need to act on it and make sure it doesn't get blocked if it is included in any package. Second, this is something that didn't come up, but we've been discussing. How do we, in legislation, how do we include provisions around technical assistance for Puerto Rico to implement some of these programs? Some of the recommendations we have are based on federal programs that we don't have, but that we're hoping we can implement at the local level. Can we have technical assistance around things like welfare to work subsidies, sector-based strategies, after school, early childhood? Those are all important pieces of this plan, and that's something that can be done from the agency level to support their successful implementation. Third, another issue didn't come up, but we've also discussed, we are happy to begin conversing about the social services cap that Puerto Rico has under Social Security Act. It's the Section 1108, in which certain social programs are capped in terms of the amount that Puerto Rico can receive. As an example, Puerto Rico receives around $50 million a year of TANF. That's capped. As a comparison, Mississippi receives around $100 million for more or less the same amount of children living in poverty. So that's something that we need to begin exploring. And anybody interested in that issue, please reach out. Fourth, supplemental policy measures for Puerto Rico. We've gone, and the Institute had some conversations with the census on this. What we have heard is that it is possible to do it. It just takes a little extra work and time and hours. So how can, from Congress, we perhaps make a mandate so that that is now calculated for Puerto Rico? It'll help include Puerto Rico in some of these broader child poverty conversations. Number 5, equality in grants for the territories. As this broader child poverty agenda moves, how do we make sure that we don't exclude the territories on purpose or by accident? Sometimes, it's just an afterthought. But anytime, if you are in an office and you're hearing conversations about any policy that impacts child poverty, please think Puerto Rico. We have the highest rate of child poverty in all of the United States jurisdictions, yet we get left out of the conversation constantly. We actually submitted comments for the report on this and asked for Puerto Rico to be mentioned somewhere, and there was no mention of Puerto Rico in the entire report. That's ridiculous. Accountability to Eric's point, accountability around the child poverty provisions that were included in Promesa, just creating pressure. What's being done about this? Where are we? And I think the conversation around the surplus is really important. At the end of the day, the Financial Oversight Board of Puerto Rico, the Fiscal Oversight Board, responds to Congress. So it is up to Congress to hold them accountable for how they're going to use that money. And so I think that is a very, very relevant and timely conversation. I will now open the floor to questions. And we have around, we're going a little over, but around 10 minutes. No questions, yes. No, no. He asked if Puerto Rico can utilize grants from IMF or World Bank. No, do you, yeah, Eric?
So I think just to offer one thing, while that's not possible, what the International Monetary Fund is doing is they are now doing economic statistics on Puerto Rico, which is very valuable information for a lot of the things we care about.
Yeah, so we are, as I said, a nonpartisan, nonprofit entity. So our role with the government of Puerto Rico is to provide them with data and information and recommendations. This study just came out, so we are going to begin engaging with some government actors around this. We also plan to engage with those who are going to be running in the elections for 2020 over the next months, because we want to make sure that this issue is in all platforms. Does that answer your question? There was another question. You had like a few. Oh, yeah. So in regards to the emergency, I mean, this is all underlying all of the emergencies that we've had, right? So we were here around a year and a half ago talking about the impact of Hurricane Maria on children and the impact on child poverty and the fact that our children were already poor to begin with. So a lot of the vulnerabilities that are coming out in these natural disasters are because there is a tremendous amount of poverty in Puerto Rico. So people don't have savings, people don't have contingency plans, right? And so to the extent that these things continue to happen, we are going to continue seeing the same effects if we are not addressing the root problem of the issues. Yes. Yes.
So my name is Dr. Vidal. I'm actually a pediatrician. I'm proud to say that I serve many of the families in the diaspora, families that leave Puerto Rico, and I'm here to stories. I work in FQIC, and I'm here to stories of why they have to make the decision to leave the island because of their needs. And adverse childhood events are toxic stress are just not something you just fix in one day or impact a child over a period of months. It impacts their entire life. It impacts their brain development. It will be the epigenetic study that even shows this passes on to their children. And so this is so critically important. And so my question is, for us to be able to be heard, we have to engage with congressmen and senators here in Washington, D.C. so they can remember our story and advocate for us. So how do you do that? How do you actually engage more of your local representatives here in the state so that they can say, don't forget about Puerto Rico?
Yeah, so we have a few approaches to advocacy, but initially we begin with, actually sounds really dry, with data, because there was not a lot of data available for Puerto Rico. It was a value add that we were bringing to the table to say, look, these are the conditions that children in Puerto Rico are living in. And that's how we got our foot in the door over the last years, just because there was no one else really providing that level of data. As we evolve in our work, we have a whole unit dedicated to advocacy, leadership, and mobilization, which is the program that Nati is a part of, because we recognize the importance of informing policy, not just with data, but with the voices of those affected, and the importance of people who are affected to be empowered to use their narrative for advocacy and for change. So that is going to become an increasingly bigger part of our work at both the local level and at the federal level. But it's hugely important, that narrative and that story, yes. Any more questions? All right, well, we want to thank everybody for taking their time, especially recognizing how much is going on here today. At the Institute, we're here to have further conversations if there are any of the ideas that were floated out here that are of interest to your congressional office or agency. This is just the beginning of the conversation, and you will continue to hear from us, so thank you. and have a great afternoon.
Please visit cuantonoscuesta.com. It's in the internet, and we have all these products there, and we are asking for support for a lot of big coalition to bring change. So please sign up our petition
Yes.
and visit cuantonoscuesta.com.
Yes, and it's in Spanish and English. On the right, you'll see a little flag. The Puerto Rico flag is the Spanish version, and the United States flag has the English version. So thank you.